There's no indigenous English population. The truth says otherwise. We're told the English aren't indigenous, that we're just a mix of invaders with no true connection to this land. But why is it only the English who are denied their identity? Genetic studies confirm that over 90% of English DNA traces back over 1,000 years. We are not a nation of immigrants, we are a nation of heritage and lineage. The Y-DNA haplogroups found in English men today prove our ancestry. R1BU106, the dominant Anglo-Saxon and Germanic marker, common in England but rare in Scotland, Wales and Ireland. I1. A Nordic Germanic marker tied to Anglo-Saxons and Vikings concentrated in eastern and northern England. R1A found in smaller numbers linked to Scandinavian and Indo-European migrations. Compare that to R1BL21, the dominant Celtic haplogroup found in Scotland, Ireland and Wales, but far less in England. This is genetic proof that the English are not just British Celts who speak English. Mitochondrial DNA confirms the same. Our maternal lineage is rooted in populations that have lived here for thousands of years. This is not a theory, this is scientific fact. The Anglo-Saxons didn't just rule England, they became it. Unlike the Romans, they settled and created the very identity of the land. This was a golden age of English strength and learning. Reflecting on this era, Mark Morris noted, "To the Anglo-Saxons themselves, the cities established by the Romans were places of mystery, wondrous but useless, the haunted relics of a vanished civilization." Bede the Venerable, one of the greatest historians of his time, documented the rise of the English in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, proving that our story was worth telling. Alfred the Great, the only English king to be called great, didn't just fight off the Vikings, he hunted them. He burned their war camps, cut off their supplies, and turned a battered England into an unbreakable kingdom. He rebuilt what they had burned. He taught his people to fight, to learn, and to reclaim what was theirs. That is what it means to be English. And then there's Beowulf, the first great English epic. A tale of blood, honour and destiny. A foreign warrior standing in the cold torchlight flickering on his sword. Inside the great hall, men huddle in fear, whispering of the beast that comes in the night. Grendel, the invader. A monster that slaughters English warriors as they sleep. Beowulf doesn't fight for gold or power, he fights because it is his duty, because a strong man protects his own. The lesson? The English have always fought to defend their homeland. Between 25% and 47% of modern English DNA comes from Anglo-Saxons. That is not a ruling elite, that is a nation. So when they tell you England has always been a nation of immigrants, they're lying. Cheddar Man was black, the lies they tell about Britain's first people. In 2018, researchers analysed the DNA of Cheddar Man, a 10,000-year-old skeleton discovered in Somerset, England. The findings suggested he had dark skin, blue eyes and dark curly hair. But what did the media do? Instead of reporting the facts, the media lied. The BBC, The Guardian, Channel 4, headline after headline declared that the first Britons were black. They weren't mistaken. They deliberately twisted the data, pushing the idea that ancient Britain was African. Why? To rewrite history, to undermine the truth, to push the idea that the English have no ancestral claim to their own land. Cheddar Man belonged to a population called Western Hunter-Gatherers, WHG, a Mesolithic group that lived across Europe during the Stone Age. They were not sub-Saharan African, nor were they related to any modern African populations. So where do we find Cheddar Man's DNA today? Exclusively in Europeans. His closest modern relatives are white Europeans, particularly in Britain and Ireland. Studies have shown that up to 10% of modern British DNA can be traced back to these early hunter-gatherers. Cheddar Man's Y-DNA haplogroup was I2A, a lineage found almost exclusively in European populations today. It is especially common among the native peoples of Britain and Ireland, not Africa. His maternal haplogroup was U5, one of the oldest genetic lineages in Europe, found in Ice Age Europeans and still present in modern European populations. These haplogroups are a direct link between Cheddar Man and modern Europeans, proving that he was part of an ancient European lineage, not an African one. If Cheddar Man had African ancestry, his Y DNA and mtDNA would be found in sub-Saharan Africa today. It isn't. Cheddar Man's dark skin was not sub-Saharan African in origin. It was the result of a specific genetic adaptation common in early European hunter-gatherers. His pigmentation was linked to the SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 genes, which regulate melanin production. This variation existed in WHG populations long before sub-Saharan Africans even became genetically distinct. As farming populations like the Belbeka people replaced the WHG, genes for lighter skin spread across Britain. This is why modern Europeans have paler skin than their ancient ancestors, not because of immigration, but because of natural selection within their own populations. This isn't a mistake. It's a deliberate distortion of history to push a political agenda. By falsely claiming that the first Britons were African, certain groups aim to undermine the idea of an indigenous English population. If everyone is an immigrant, then no one has a rightful claim to their own land. Push the nation of immigrants myth to justify mass migration and deny English identity while other nations are allowed to celebrate their heritage. But science doesn't lie. The English have a direct, traceable genetic lineage in this land for thousands of years. Diversity built England, not the English people themselves, the lies they tell. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived, they didn't simply take over a thriving nation, they built something new. They formed the first English kingdoms, wrote the first English laws, and gave this land its name, England, the land of the Angles. Christianity unified the people, bringing education and order. St. Augustine in 597 AD didn't bring diversity, he brought civilization. Through the church came literacy, governance, and structure, giving England a foundation that would last for centuries. And when England was attacked, it was the English who fought for it. Alfred the Great drove back the Viking invasions, ensuring England remained in English hands. Between 865–878 AD, the Viking Great Heathen Army occupied half of England, but Alfred's military reforms helped secure victory. Alfred the Great's success against the Vikings was not just military, it was cultural. He unified the English under one banner, proving that England was already a nation long before later conquests. Henry V's army crushed the French at Agincourt. No foreign army came to save England, the English defended their own. The Anglo-Saxons built the first distinctly English settlements, raised the first stone churches like St. Peter's in Bradwell-on-Sea, built in 654 AD by St. Ced on the ruins of the abandoned Roman fort of Athona, using its stone and bricks to raise a new house of worship where Roman legions once stood. Commissioned by King Sigebert the Good to bring Christianity to the East Saxons, it became a beacon of the new faith in a land still clinging to its pagan past. And when London burned, the flames swallowed the city, one street at a time. The fire leapt from rooftops, the wind feeding its hunger. The great lead roof of St. Paul's melted like wax, flowing into the streets. Families screamed in the night, their homes reduced to embers. The people cried out for salvation. And then, when the smoke cleared and the ruin was laid bare, who rebuilt it? The English. London was not abandoned, nor did it fall. It rose again. The rebuilding was led by Christopher Wren, who reimagined the city with grander, safer structures, wider streets, and a skyline dominated by his masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, where fire had destroyed, English hands rebuilt, not just restoring London, but defining the city we know today. The Magna Carta was written by English barons to protect English rights. It was not a product of diversity, but of a uniquely English struggle for freedom. David Carpenter, medieval historian, Magna Carta, 2015. In 2020, the government released the Diversity Built Britain 50p coin, an open attempt to rewrite history. The media, the government, and left-wing academics continue to push this false narrative, claiming that Britain was always multicultural. The idea that diversity built Britain is historically inaccurate. England was built by its own people long before mass migration ever occurred. David Starkey, historian. Mass immigration to Britain only began in large numbers after 1948 with the Windrush generation, not in medieval or Anglo-Saxon times. And now, they want you to forget, to believe that your ancestors don't matter, that your history is a mistake, that your identity can be erased, but they are wrong. We are the builders of this nation, this is our land, and we are not going anywhere. The English today are actually Normans, the lie that won't die. They tell us the English aren't really English, that we're actually Normans, that the conquest of 1066 replaced the Anglo-Saxon people, and that our identity is nothing more than a footnote of history. But that's a lie. If the Normans had truly replaced the English, then our DNA would show it. But modern genetic studies tell a very different story. The dominant Y-DNA haplogroups in English men today are R1BU106, I1 and R1A, all Germanic markers associated with Anglo-Saxon and Viking ancestry. If the Normans had reshaped England's genetic makeup, we would see large traces of Gallo-Roman and Frankish markers. But we don't. The Norman ruling class, largely descended from Viking settlers in France, were a tiny elite minority. They took land, power and wealth, but they did not replace the English. The genetic continuity between the pre-Norman and modern English population is overwhelming. DNA studies confirm that the English are a blend of the Britons, with a substantial Anglo-Saxon and small amount of Norse influence, the Norman contribution almost non-existent. If the Normans had wiped out and replaced the English, we would expect to see an entirely new population in the records of the time. But when William the Conqueror ordered the Domesday Book in 1086, the Great Survey of Land Ownership, something became very clear. The ruling class had changed, but the people had not. The Normans came as tyrants. They burned English villages, slaughtered families who resisted, and imposed foreign rule. But despite their brutality, they never broke the English spirit. The English endured. And in time, we reclaimed our land, our language, and our identity. Before 1066, Anglo-Saxon landowners controlled nearly all of England. After the conquest, William redistributed land to his Norman lords, and within a few decades, over 90% of England's land was in Norman hands. But the land itself didn't change, and neither did the people working it. The Anglo-Saxon peasantry, artisans, and freemen remained. The English did not disappear. They were ruled over, taxed and oppressed, but they remained the heart of the nation. The very fact that William needed to conduct the Domesday Survey at all proves this. He was not ruling over a Norman nation, he was ruling over the English. They may have imposed French as the language of the elite, but Old English survived among the people and evolved into Middle English, regaining dominance by the 14th century. The aristocracy may have been foreign, but England remained English. Even the monarchy eventually merged back into the native population. By the time of the Wars of the Roses, England was no longer ruled by Normans in any real sense. The ruling families were just as English as the people. The Normans didn't replace the English, they ruled over them for a time. But England was never truly theirs.